Hey guys, so I hope you're well. I just want to talk about something that I've talked about many times before. Sometimes I feel like I'm a broken record that I just keep repeating myself, but I'm going to keep repeating myself until I feel the message gets through. I would go out on a limb and say that most of you that are on this group are interested in self-preservation. One of the main reasons or main motivations that you began training was likely because you wanted to learn how to protect yourself. Now, if you reflect on your training, especially if you've looked at or have engaged in different systems that are specifically and supposedly geared for self-preservation, what probably happened is that you went into the academy, you learned specific techniques, and then you drilled them against a would-be attacker. And more than likely, that would-be attacker would be giving you the specific scenario that you need to defend against. So let me give you an example. Let's say we were looking at how do we deal with somebody getting us in a side headlock, right? Which is typical kind of thing you see in street situations. Somebody grabs you around the head and tries to pump you with the other hand, right? With the hand that is free. And you learned a specific sequence on how to deal with that. Now, almost without exception, that is pretty much where most training in self-preservation, or under the kind of rubric of reality-based self-defense, begins and ends. Again, let's reflect on that. You came in, you learned specific techniques, right? Whatever that was required in order to achieve success in the scenario that you're about to learn. You go in, you are allowed to go through the scenario where the person that is the would-be attacker does a specific thing like the side headlock, and then you work your defensive and offensive action against that opponent from there, and then you repeat. So in a way, if we looked at that as a chess example, that's like me doing an opening in chess, right, against an opponent, 3 moves, and then we take all the moves back, and then we do the opening again, and then we take all the moves back, and then we do the opening again. Would that ever lead to me being able to play chess at a high level? No. The only way to play chess at a high level is to play the entirety of the game, which requires then for you to deal with an opponent that is not telling you what they're about to do. So you constantly have to be adaptable to the situation unfolding in front of you, and you have to respond accordingly. So if we come back to my example of what's typically presented in reality-based self-defense, there is a massive glaring problem with that approach that I described. Learn some techniques, do a predefined scenario, and let's continue the predefined scenario. Then we continue. We learn a couple of techniques. We define a new scenario. Maybe now we're looking at what happens when somebody punches you, right? And they throw a punch at you or a hook. And I'm going to defend that hook in a certain way. And I'm going to follow up with certain kinds of strikes, whatever I've been learned. Okay, let's take it all back and we do it again. You can do that as many times as you want to, 1,000 times, 10,000 times. And I promise you, I guarantee you that when you are actually faced with an aggressive opponent whose entire intention is to eliminate you, to take you off this planet, to kill you, that there is a very strong likelihood that nothing that you have trained will ever come out as you have trained it. Those sequences will not materialize if the only way that you've ever trained is how I've been describing up until now. Now, my approach is very different. Of course, there has to be a starting point when you learn. So I have to teach you those techniques, especially if you don't know what they are. Then I will define a scenario. I'll say, okay, if person A does this, I want you to do this, right? So that what that does is it gives you a reference point on how to apply the techniques and a basic context on how that would look against somebody that was trying to do you harm. That would be stage 2. That would not be the end of training. There are going to be more stages that need to be added in order to be successful in the end, so that I feel confident as the coach and that you feel confident as the student that should the shit hit the fan, you will be able to apply what you've been learning. So an example of that would be to create another scenario where, for example, let's say we have been working on 5 potential different kinds of attacks. So I've got 5 different attacks. We've worked through those 5 attacks and I've given you an idea on how to deal with it. Then we can take those 5 attacks and we can randomize it, meaning that rather than going through the sequence that we learned them, the person that's now going to attack you can choose from any of the 5. You now have to respond against one of those 5 as it unfolds in front of you. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this has to be done at speed, and I don't want to go into too much detail because there's lots of ways to set this up. But what I'm trying to bring across is that those 2 steps, learning the techniques, building it into a scenario, are only the first 2 steps. But I'm going to make this point again. Go look on YouTube. 99.9% of the times, what is passed off as reality-based self-defense, what most people are watching, what most people are in awe of, the videos that have 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 views, is all the kinds of bullshit that I'm describing here, where a person does X techniques against a person attacking them, however, knows what that attack is, and it's only that attack, right? So in my example of taking, for example, 5 scenarios that we've gone through and then randomizing it changes the game completely, because now you don't know which of the 5 are going to present themselves. Of course, it's still manageable because there are 5 options, right? So these are all baby steps, getting to the point where, anything could come out. But there are 5 things this person can do, but you don't know which of the 5 is going to show up. Now, I've done this many times in my academy, in seminars around the world, and it's really interesting to watch, right? So a person can go through each individual scenario and do pretty okay, because one, they know what's coming at them. The other person is not really resisting, so they're giving you the appropriate attack and energy, and then you working your counter against that, right? Your defensive action against that, knowing what that defensive action is. Not hard to do. Pretty difficult to fuck up, right? To make real mistakes. Then all of a sudden we take 5 that you've been working through on that particular day, and we throw in some randomization, and a lot of things go out the window, right? Because 1, now you have to remember it. 2, you don't know which one it's going to be. 3, you have to react and adapt in that moment. And so we now start, if I stand back, what I see is just a semblance, okay, a resemblance of what it was that we trained. There are pieces that are missing, which now it starts to make the student understand that the reality of interpersonal violence is not neat, controlled, defined outcomes. It is complex, it is chaotic, it is unpredictable, right? When you have a person in front of you that is fighting back, that is resisting, that is not telling you what they're going to do, where you have no idea what this person's background is and where they've come from, what they've trained and what they haven't. You are going to have to bring to bear in that very moment in time everything you've learned. And if you've only ever got to stage 2 of training, which is like I keep saying over and over, right? I'm banging my head up against the wall here because people buy into this bullshit all the fucking time. Most instructionals is this bullshit. Most of the money you're spending on other people's stuff and courses and so forth is this stuff, right? That's what you're getting. Stage 1 and stage 2, and that's it. And you learn that and you play around with it with a buddy and you walk off and you think, okay, I know how to protect myself. No, you don't. You have no idea how to protect yourself. You've learned some moves. So what? Can you actually apply that when the shit hits the fan? When you actually have a resisting, uncooperative opponent? And that's not even taking into account multiple variables that come into play in self-preservation, right? It may not be one-on-one. It may not be in a nice, clean, sterile environment like the academy. You may be in a barrio. You might be in the middle of a jungle. You may be on the beach. You in the middle of a city, a dense city, right? You might be in an alleyway where there's stuff everywhere. You might be on a road that has gravel. You may be on a slope. You may be standing on sand. You may be standing on something that is wet, so forth and so forth and so forth. And then also your temperament. Who are you as a person? Have you actually trained for the fight in such a way that it's not just the physical? Has there been an enormous amount of time spent on how you are going to manage the physiological changes and what your head is telling you in that moment? Have you trained for that? All of these are all the steps that are required down the road to becoming successful at being able to protect yourself. All right, so I described one more step. I said, okay, third step is let's take scenarios that we've trained. Let's randomize them. Let's throw them in. That's just the third step. What would be the fourth step? The fourth step would be let's take those same 5 possibilities. Let's randomize them. However, this time, once the person who is attacking you has done that initial attack, I want that person to continue the fight. So if we come back to the headlock position, person gets you in a headlock, they're going to pretend to throw, one strike. You go through the sequence that you've learned how to protect yourself against that. This time around, I want the person doing the headlock to fight back. In other words, work to defeat the counter that you are now trying to apply. Let's see what happens then. That's even more interesting. Take another step back, right? As me as the coach watching that. Now things completely don't look like we did when we trained them because suddenly the variable has changed into an unpredictable, chaotic environment. When I say fight back, if you did that exact same training experience and we had 10 people on the mat and you had those 5 options and you're going to go up against 5 different people, all of which have been told after the initial attack that we've trained to deal with to continue to fight back and actually try to defeat what you're doing, each time that's likely going to be different because each person's going to respond differently. Coming out of this, it comes back to something that I've said so many times. It's not about how much you have learned. It's not about an accumulation of techniques. It is ultimately about adaptability. How adaptable are you able to be? Can you adapt what you have trained to multiple environments? That's why when I describe what we do, regardless if it's Crazy Monkey Defense, Monkey Jits, and even our Weaponize Your Body program, which is very much focused on self-preservation, and we typically do teach that to law enforcement and people that don't have the time or the luxury to come in and train every single week. I describe it as a combat athletic all-terrain self-preservation approach. Combat athletic, because I want to be training against a resisting, uncooperative opponent, right? Self-preservation, because that's where I want to focus. All-terrain, meaning, can I bring to bear the stuff that I believe to know in any environment that I would find myself in, with as little and as minimal amount of change and adjustment. Of course, environment dictates behavior, right? It would be different in some respects. There's going to be a change where if I have to protect myself in a jungle versus city streets. But knowing that what I bring forth in that moment in time needs to be techniques, right? And ability that is all-terrain, meaning that it should cross over in those different domains. And that's where I've done a lot of work with Special Force military operators, close protection teams, and so forth, right? Is that getting them to understand that it's not about how much I teach you and how many scenarios we go through. Rather, can I throw different scenarios at you, even ones that we haven't even gone through, and can you bring to bear those tools that we've been working on, the multi-tool approach rather than a toolbox, right? It's not about how much I have, it's what I have and can apply. Can you bring that to bear in that particular situation? And that is the mark of being able to protect yourself. Again, bringing back to what I said, and as I close off on this, I'm not going through all the steps. There's several different ways and approaches that I take to ensure that students can protect themselves and deal with an uncooperative, resisting opponent, deal with the chaos of the fight. But I want you to understand that true self-preservation is multifaceted, but the goal is to bring it down to its simplest components, not simplistic, but simplest components that can be brought to bear in any terrain that you find yourself. Crucial to that is that it's not just my physical ability, which is obviously important. It's not just my understanding of the techniques. It's not just my level of fitness so that I can endure the situation that I find myself in, right? So having the cardio, knowing, how to breathe in a fight. But crucially, and which is completely overlooked, right? So if I say that most people do 1 and 2 steps, then that's where it begins and ends. And they don't even touch on how and what is happening to me in the midst of interpersonal violence. The biological, the physiological changes that I have to deal with. And then in turn, how I interpret those in the moment and how that interpretation will affect the outcome of what I want to do. You can train as long as you like in these reality-based self-defense approaches. For 10 years, I don't care. But if you've never dealt with how to work with fear in that moment, when somebody actually wants to eliminate you, none of that's ever going to come out. I've seen it time and time again, right? I've seen people who are quote-unquote black belts, in particular martial systems, end up getting their asses handed to them by a no-brand, no-name street fighter for one simple reason. The street fighter is used to getting into those interpersonal conflict situations, has learned how to deal with the internal chaos that arises within, and has been able to convert that into an ability to do the business, to do what they need to do to win the fight. While the black belt has played at martial skills and now suddenly has to deal with the stuff who they are, right? And they may not have the necessary temperament or even definitely no training on how to deal with what arises inside and completely get smashed and annihilated. So I want you to focus on this. I want you to realize this. I want you to question everything that's put out there, especially in light of what I've said. It's not my place to do it. I never get involved in any of the conversations online. I never call anybody out by name. I have 10 names in my head right now of people that I see all the time on Facebook and YouTube that are just, in my mind, bullshit artists, racking up the dollars, taking people's money, pretending that they're actually teaching people how to protect themselves. Yes, they look really cool, got fast, blitzy techniques and all that stuff, but it's all 1 and 2. Okay, it stops at 2. And everybody's sitting around there with their mouths open going, oh, wow, not realizing that all they are watching is a pre-rehearsed training process, right? A pre-rehearsed drill, which is no different to a kata, which is no different to fight choreography in a Hollywood movie, but cannot make the distinction and cannot even see that this is all good and well, but let me see this person that's teaching there, this person that has 100 people, 200 people around them, that everybody paid a few $100s to be. Let me see this person actually do what they are saying, what they are showing, when they don't know it's going to happen, right? When it's random. Even there, if I use this example of putting 5 scenarios, if that person taught 5 scenarios on the day, and I said, okay, you taught us 5 scenarios today, I'm going to come at you with any one of those 5s, and I want you to do what you showed us. I bet anything that they're not going to be able to do it. And if they are, it's not going to look like anything that they showed, right? If anything, they're going to fold. I can tell you right now that if you challenge that person to do that, they would make excuses. They'd say no, or they'd say whatever, that's for the next level of training. They'll come up with something because they don't want to, because they can't, right? My best example always, and it's a name that I have in my head, but I'm not going to mention it, is a very well-known reality-based self-defense guy over the last few years, all over the internet. Hundreds of people coming to his seminars, spending money, people flying in from all over the world, right? Especially those people who always say they don't have money, but they can find money to go and do things like that. Teaching all this stuff, and all these people sitting there with their mouths wide open thinking it's amazing. And then a video surfaces of this particular person doing an MMA match and not even fighting somebody of skill and getting his ass handed to him and looking like a fucking amateur, right? Why? Because everything that he teaches is not against resistance. It's not against an uncooperative opponent. It's not against somebody who's not going to tell him what they're about to do, right? And as long as we have that, it's bullshit, right? It doesn't matter how nice it looks. It doesn't matter how Hollywood it looks. It doesn't matter how flash it looks. It's still bullshit, right? Step 1 and step 2 are only the beginning. They are not the end.